Is Jesse Kirshner. I'm the Water and Climate Programs Coordinator here at OWEB. And I'm going to be presenting a lot of information today, along with my colleague, Eric Hartstein. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. Eric Hartstein, Policy Coordinator at OWEB.
So we have a lot of content to cover. And just a couple of housekeeping items. As you saw, the meeting is being recorded. We will likely post the recording and the slides on our website. My plan is to also try and post an abbreviated version of this because 2 hours is a long time to ask anybody to listen to a webinar and then also to listen to a recording. So we'll see if I can get there. The breakout groups that we're going to be having, we're going to have 2 short breakout group activities. Those will not be recorded. And if you have questions as I'm going through the material or as Eric's going through the material, feel free to type them in the chat, but we're going to try and save those to dedicated Q&A times at the end of different sections. And then in those breakout group activities, you're going to have a lot of opportunity to have some Q&A and dialogue with the regional program representatives and other folks here at OWEB to help answer anything that may have come up as we've shared this material. So just a brief agenda. So this welcome and brief introduction, we're going to have a short overview of the climate evaluation criteria, basically how did we get here and where are we going? And then we are going to spend the bulk of the time talking about how you can respond to the climate criteria in our grant application questions. So touching on assessing climate changes and impacts, looking at your project activities in the context of adaptation and mitigation, and then engagement with local communities disproportionately impacted by climate change. So we're going to go into all of this in a lot more detail. The intended audience for this training, just as a reminder, is primarily OWEB grant applicants, past, current, future, as well as our regional review team members. If you don't find yourself in this audience, that's okay. I've had some folks reach out to me and ask to attend just to kind of get a sense of what we're doing and what we're up to and how it might apply in their work as well. But this is primarily the audience that this training is intended for. And just an important note, hoping to avoid any kind of confusion, this is not about a new grant program here at OWEB. It's about new evaluation criteria that have been added to our existing grant programs. So where we've added climate-related criteria to our restoration, technical assistance, stakeholder engagement, monitoring. So this is, again, not about a new grant program, about our existing grant programs and new evaluation criteria that are being applied. So the goal of this training is to help build the capacity of our applicants to more effectively respond to these climate evaluation criteria. Our objectives are to provide training and resources for applicants. And then really we want to use those breakout group activities as an opportunity to encourage learning and exchange of ideas on responding to these climate criteria. So we recognize that a lot of our grant applicants and folks here on the phone with us today already are thinking about climate and what they're doing. And then there's going to be some folks that maybe haven't thought about it as much. And so we'd really love for those that have thought about it more to share some of your thoughts and insights as to how you've been thinking about it with those that maybe haven't. So we want to see that learning and exchange of ideas and conversation among everybody here today. So at the end of the training, our goal is that you will have an understanding of how to respond to the new climate evaluation criteria in our grant applications, and you are going to also know where you can find resources to assist you in writing your responses. I'm going to turn it over here to Eric Hartstein to talk a little bit about the history of how this all happened and the specific climate criteria that we're working with now.
Great. Thanks, Jesse. Again, my name is Eric Hartstein. I'm OWEB's Policy Coordinator, and I'll give you a quick background on how the climate-related evaluation criteria came to be. So starting with a timeline from where we've been, the OWEB board has been really interested in integrating climate action into the agency's grant programs for several years now. And this has sort of culminated in the passage of the board's climate resolution in January of 2022. So the resolution states that OWEB will integrate climate mitigation and adaptation in budgeting, investing, and policymaking decisions by funding climate smart adaptation and resilience, funding projects that include meaningful emissions reductions, carbon sequestration, and protection of carbon storage and habitat restoration, and valuing project co-benefits and assessing long-term sustainability of projects. So the resolution also states that OWEB will learn and apply diversity, equity, inclusion, and environmental justice principles when making funding decisions to address challenges arising from climate change to traditionally underrepresented and impacted communities, and engage traditionally underrepresented and impacted communities in processes to craft meaningful solutions that are integrated into funding decisions. So getting back to the timeline, so following the passage of the board's climate resolution, OWEB staff then conducted a public engagement process around implementing the resolution in the spring of 2022. So during this process, we had 6 virtual listening sessions for the public. We had 1 listening session that was exclusively for tribes. We had an online survey that had nearly 80 responses, and interviews with what we consider non-traditional partners that we asked a consultant to conduct on our behalf as a part of a separate process. And finally, we just had one-on-one conversations with folks that were interested in following up with OWEB staff. So getting back to the timeline, following the public engagement process, at the July 2022 board meeting, the OWEB board authorized rulemaking to integrate climate-related evaluation criteria into OWEB's grant programs. And then beginning late last year, OWEB staff then took some of those themes that we heard during the public engagement process, themes around including developing broad evaluation criteria, making sure that we maximize all project benefits, making sure that we're starting qualitative and then moving to quantitative, and also considering trade-offs with any mitigation-based evaluation criteria. So we all took that and began working with a rulemaking advisory committee to develop the climate-related evaluation criteria. The rulemaking advisory committee itself had 12 members representing current grantees, applicants. We had tribal representation, non-traditional partners, review team members, and a Oregon Ag Heritage Commission member. So the group met 4 times last winter and spring to help develop the evaluation criteria. So if you go to OWEB's website, you can actually see all the meeting materials and recordings of all those meetings, if you are so interested. And once we had developed a final draft of the evaluation criteria with the assistance of the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, we moved to a formal public comment and had a public hearing on the rules this past spring. And then following that public comment period in July, the OWEB board approved the climate-related evaluation criteria. So the rules themselves read that in addition to the evaluation criteria found in existing grant programs, applications shall also be evaluated whenever possible on how engagement with and input from local communities disproportionately impacted by climate change has informed or will inform the project, how changing climate conditions are incorporated into the project, and how the project will contribute to durable adaptation and resilience for ecosystems, including human communities, and how consideration of greenhouse gas emissions or long-term carbon sequestration or storage has informed the project. So also included in the rules are definitions for the terms that were used in the evaluation criteria. And so these include carbon sequestration, carbon storage, durable adaptation and resilience for ecosystems, and a definition for local communities disproportionately impacted by climate change. And so just to kind of illuminate how the new climate-related evaluation criteria are included in the existing evaluation criteria, we have this example from OWEB's restoration evaluation criteria. And this includes elements related to cost effectiveness of the project, proposal clarity, technical soundness of the project. And here's where we include the criteria related to how changing climate conditions are incorporated and how the project may contribute to adaptation and resilience, along with how consideration of greenhouse gas emissions or long-term carbon sequestration or storage has informed the project. We're also looking to place the project in a watershed context, and then the capacity of the applicant. And this is where we include the criterion on how did engagement with local communities disproportionately impacted by climate change inform or will inform the project. So as this example shows, that these are 3 evaluation criteria related to climate, and with restoration, it's 3 of 19 evaluation criteria, just to put things into context. And then finally, back to the timeline. After the board adopted the rules in July, we quickly updated our grant applications to include questions related to the climate-related evaluation criteria in time for the fall open solicitation grant offering. And I will turn it back over to you, Jesse.
Thanks, Eric. So now we're going to spend the bulk of the time talking about how to respond to the new climate criteria then are in our grant applications. So in general, the first thing that I want to flag for you is that our climate criteria have been added to existing application questions. So this is something that's come up in the past. In our previous applications, we had a separate non-evaluative section that included climate questions. That section has now been removed. So you will not see that in the grant applications any longer. And instead, you will see the climate questions added into existing questions, or in some cases, they'll be their own new question. And this is an example for the monitoring application and how we've integrated the climate criteria. So this is for methods and design, where it says to describe the study design used to choose sampling locations, parameters, and frequency. And what we've added is, wherever possible, explain how consideration of changing climate conditions informed the selection of those monitoring locations, parameters, or frequency of data collection. Similarly, the existing question read to describe in detail the monitoring methods that will be followed, and then we just added, wherever possible, explain how consideration of greenhouse gas emissions informed the selection of your methods. So like I said, in many cases, you're going to see these climate criteria are just integrated into a question that you're already going to be answering. So it's just asking you to respond to that as part of the larger answer that you are writing. So in your grant applications, you're going to be asked about climate changes and impacts, how changing climate conditions have been incorporated, and then the adaptation, resilience, and carbon sequestration and storage benefits, consideration of greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration and storage, and then engagement with local communities disproportionately impacted by climate change, and how that engagement and their input has informed or will inform your project. So I'm going to spend a lot of time diving into each of these in a little bit more detail and talk you through some of the resources and things that we've created to help you to answer these different questions. But I just want to flag that particularly these first two, one of the things that we've seen over the years, and then as I was looking through the responses to the non-evaluative climate questions, was that we have a really wide spectrum of where people are at in terms of integrating climate change into their grant application responses already. Some people aren't doing it at all or doing it very little, and then we have some applicants that have already been thinking about climate and incorporating it into their description about watershed problems, or the kinds of actions and activities that they're implementing because it's responding to climate change in some way. For those of you that have already been doing that, great, keep doing it. That's what we're looking for. But the purpose of this training is to get some of those folks that maybe haven't been thinking about it as much up to that same level of just basic understanding of where do I find this kind of information and how do I incorporate it into my project. So particularly for these first two, if some of you have already been thinking about this in a lot of detail and incorporating it, it might seem not as, maybe not as relevant, or you're like, I'm already doing this, but just know that we're really trying to make sure that folks are all starting from that base level of understanding and get people on the same sort of playing level. So to that end, one of the resources that was created was what I'm calling a quick guide, which is really just a workbook, and it's intended to aid our applicants in writing their responses to the climate evaluation criteria. So it just takes you through a basic stepwise process of assessing climate changes and impacts and how that can be used to look at adaptation, resilience, and carbon sequestration activities and responses, and then considering GHG emissions and engagement with local communities. So this quick guide is really intended for folks who have little to no experience incorporating climate information into their applications. And it's for people that just kind of would like to have sort of that step-by-step process. And I'll be referring to it throughout my presentation. Whether or not you find it useful, it's up to you, but it is available on our website. I will ask maybe one of my other co-facilitators if they would pop a link into the chat for me of where folks could find this on our website. So as I said, you're going to be asked about all these different things. So we're going to start with the first thing that you're going to be asked about, which is climate changes and impacts. So this is an example from the restoration grant application where in the problem statement, it asks you to describe the watershed problems, including climate changes and impacts that the restoration project seeks to address. So this has again been directly integrated into an existing question. So the first, we just need you to highlight the climate variables that are most significant for your particular watershed or your project. So this table that I have here are some of the common climate variables that people tend to identify, things like reduced soil moisture and drought, increased wildfire risk, altered stream flows, whether they be lower or higher, sea level rise if you're out on the coast, things like warmer temperatures and extreme heat. So we want you to be thinking about the climate stressors that you're already seeing impact your watershed or project, or you think will have the most significant impact on your watershed or project. So for an example, say that I have a grassland restoration project and I've already seen some pretty significant impacts due to increased drought stress. And I am more concerned about altered precipitation patterns and continuing increases in invasive species. So these are the ones that I'm going to highlight in my response. So then you're going to need to summarize the observed or projected climate changes based on those factors that you've highlighted. So for example, we've seen persistent and severe droughts in the last 20 years. Climate models are projecting less precipitation during the growing season, and the models also project an increased severity and duration of drought. So to help you in this, we know we don't want you to go searching through all the different climate literature that's out there. There's a lot that's available. What we've done is tried to really curate and narrow down the information for you. And so we've created OWEB regional climate summaries, which are available on our website. And I'm just going to give you a quick tour of what those look like. So on our website, under the resources tab, there's now a whole new section that's been added that says climate and water resources. And so you can scroll down, and for each of the OWEB regions, we have information that summarizes climate changes and impacts for that region. We did combine regions 5 and 6 just based on the climate data and information that's available for those regions. So you'll see them combined here. But for example, if you pick on your region, say you're in Central Oregon, and you look at the climate document, what you're going to see is just a summary of what the observed and projected climate changes are for that region for things like air and water temperature, precipitation and drought, hydrology, disturbances. And then at the bottom, it shows you where we sourced this information from. So what we're hoping is that this helps folks hone in on being able to summarize observed and projected changes quickly, rather than you having to go out and look through the source reports yourselves and find that information, that you can just refer to the information that we've compiled here and use that in writing your response. There are a number of other resources that we recommend that are also available if you are interested in diving a bit more deeply into what projected climate changes and impacts might look like. The Oregon Climate Change Research Institute has a couple of really interesting things. In addition to the climate assessments, they are now doing future climate projections for all of Oregon counties. They have, I think, half the state's been done, and then they have the rest of the state planned, so you can get very detailed projections for your county. And then the climate toolbox, if you want to do some more mapping, look at some mapping, and they have a whole host of different tools that are available that you can look at. But for those short on time or just want to really narrow down on the information, the regional climate summaries is a quick way to do that. So once you know what the observed and projected changes are, we would like you to summarize what the impacts are on your watershed or project. So this is so similar to what you've already been doing. You've already been describing what the watershed problems are. Now we're just asking you to include climate change in that. And in many cases, you're already seeing the impacts of climate change in your watersheds. It's just another stressor like the other stressors you're already talking about. So we just want you to be summarizing maybe some of the impacts that you've already seen. If you've already seen persistent and severe drought, maybe you've already noticed a decline, for example, in grassland community diversity as a result of that. And then when you think about if there's going to be altered precipitation, we're likely to see decreased spring precipitation, increased drought. That could shift the composition and abundance of our grasslands to more drought tolerant or invasive species. So summarizing these impacts can really be based on your local knowledge and expertise. You know your systems, you know what impacts you've already seen. Be sure to draw on that. You don't need to go always to the literature to find out what those impacts are. But you are also welcome to, and if you would like, we've also compiled some resources for you on that. So in addition to the climate variables summaries for the different regions, we have some summaries on habitats and species impacts that you can look at. And then the Forest Service Adaptation Partners, which is from the Pacific Northwest Research Station, they have done climate change vulnerability assessments, which cover a large swath of Oregon. I think the main gap is going to be the southeastern part of the state. But if you want to take a look at, they have very detailed reports looking at impacts on habitats and species across our state, and you can take a look at those different documents. So now going back to our application question, where we ask you to describe the problem, including climate changes and impacts, we want you to just draw on what we just summarized. So persistent and severe droughts have occurred in the region. The long-term drought we've already seen has led to a decline in grassland community diversity. Climate models project less precipitation and increased droughts. And because of that, we're likely to see changes in grassland composition and abundance, including increases in invasive species or drought-tolerant species. So our hope is that this can just be integrated, this kind of information, into your response already on describing what the watershed problems are. Okay, so moving on to the next one, which is being asked about how changing climate conditions have been incorporated into the project, and then the adaptation, resilience, and carbon sequestration and storage benefits. And this corresponds to step 2 in that quick guide. So here's an example application question. This is from stakeholder engagement. So the current question asks you to describe the direct correlation that the engagement effort will have with future restoration or acquisition activities. And then what we have asked is that, as applicable, describe how the resulting project or outcome considers changing climate conditions. And we typically have protecting or restoring fish or wildlife habitat, watershed function, and water quality or quantity as the benefits from this. And then we've added or provides these adaptation, resilience, or carbon sequestration and storage benefits. So again, these criteria are just going to be incorporated directly into the question. So the purpose of this is for you to be thinking about whether your planned activities address any of the climate impacts that you just identified, whether there might need to be some potential modifications, or if you can think of potential modifications. You're not required to do that, but it's just something to be thinking about. You could be thinking about new activities, given that you've thought more specifically now about some of the climate impacts that you might be concerned with. And then we also are hoping to help assess the ability of our activities to promote these adaptation, resilience, and carbon sequestration and storage benefits. So this was up earlier when Eric was talking about the definitions from the rules, but just as a reminder, when we're talking about adaptation and resilience actions, these help an ecosystem, including human communities, adjust to, respond to, or recover from the effects of a changing climate. So I just want to do a brief note on adaptation and resilience, just as a little bit of framing for this, which is that when, for folks that have been working in the adaptation space for a long time, what you typically tend to see is adaptation and resilience actions. The majority of those actions are the same actions that you're already implementing. They're just made more important given climate change and the impacts that we're likely to see. So a good example of that is removing invasive species. It's something we've already been doing. That threat is likely to continue to grow and maybe in different ways or with new invasive species, but it's something, an action that we're already doing that we're likely going to want to continue. It's going to be even more important to continue doing given climate change. In some cases, we see that it might take some small tweaks to activities or actions that we're already implementing in order to improve their effectiveness. An example of that would be something like planting with native species that are better adapted to future conditions. So if we're likely to see hotter and drier conditions, then including species in our planting palette that can do well given that hotter and drier future. And then in some cases, we'll start to see, or people will start to even think about really new and different actions that maybe we haven't even thought about implementing in the past. But just given now you're sort of thinking about climate and all that it means for what you do, you are thinking, okay, I would, in this particular project, I want to explore the use of seeds from climate analog zones in my restoration project. You don't have to do this. This is just, I'm just trying to give you some general framing for when people talk about adaptation and resilience. And for those that don't know, climate analog zones are places that right now have the climate that we're likely to experience in the future. So for example, if I live in the Willamette Valley, by the end of the century, we're more likely to be like Redding, California. So I might want to be thinking about what species do really well in Redding, California right now that are likely to do well in the Willamette Valley in 100 years. Not that you have to do that, but. The point of adaptation is that it reflects the intentional consideration of climate change in your project. So not just saying like, oh, my project provides an adaptation or resilience benefit, but really understanding why it provides that benefit. So what is it about your project that's addressing climate, or your action that's addressing climate change? You know, if you are, let's see, if you are, I'm going to go through some of these examples later, so I don't want to spoil the fun now, but if you are maybe, see if I can come up with an example that you're already, well, we'll just go through the ones that I'm going to do later, which is if you are already, you're removing invasive species, but now you realize that by removing those invasive species in a time that you're going to have really challenges, a lot of challenges with soil moisture, removing invasive species becomes even more important because now you're just providing more moisture that's available for your native species. So it's the same action, but now you're framing it slightly different, right? You're thinking about it more about what impact am I helping to address by doing that. So some of the actions that you're thinking about implementing or that you're already implementing may be aimed at resisting or preventing change. So you're just trying to keep, if like we're going to see these changes, but I want to prevent them from happening as long as I possibly can. And some may allow some change, but are enabling you to return to some prior condition or a similar condition before that change happened. And some actions may enable our ecosystems to more adaptively respond to new and changing conditions. So actions can be all over the map with what they do. So what we're asking you now to think about is you have summarized what these impacts are likely to be on your watershed or project. And we want you to think about whether or not any of your planned project activities are going to help to address these impacts. So in the previous example, we highlighted that decreased spring precipitation and increased drought stress could shift the composition of our grasslands to more drought tolerant or invasive species. So the project activity, maybe I'm already planning to remove non-native annual grasses and other invasive plant species. And again, this is just a shifting of how we're framing this. Yes, if I am removing those species, I'm worried about moisture. This is going to help to reduce competition for limited soil moisture. This gives our native species a fighting chance when we have increased drought stress. If it's planned activity, do we need to modify it? Not necessarily. It's already doing what we're hoping it would do in the face of climate change. It's going to help to address that risk related to reduced moisture. Another project activity example could be planting and seeding with native species. But when you think about it and what you're planting, maybe you want to now think a little bit differently about what species mix you're planting. So you're going to start to think about those native species that are suitable under those drier conditions and hotter conditions. So because by planting a new species mix, that's going to help limit plant community sensitivity overall to moisture and limited moisture. Thinking about our project activities given climate impacts also provides an opportunity to think about ones that maybe we aren't already implementing, but we're worried about a particular impact. And you might want to think about new actions. But again, you don't have to. What we're asking is for you to just think about what you're already doing and how it addresses these climate impacts. And then we're also asking about potential carbon benefits, so whether sequestration or storage benefits as a result of these activities. So in this case, removing non-native annual grasses helps to maintain the carbon sequestration capacity of our natural ecosystems. Planting and seeding with native species helps to promote carbon sequestration. You're growing new species, which can help to uptake carbon. And then we've compiled a number of resources for you to help in responding to these questions around incorporating changing climate conditions and adaptation and resilience. The two that I recommend the most for this, the first is from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, or NIACS. They have created these menus of adaptation strategies and approaches. So this is just really here for you if you're like, I'm not certain if what I'm doing is going to address a climate impact, or I want to see what other people have thought about, what other actions might be out there. This is a good resource just to take a look and see what examples of adaptation strategies and actions might be out there. So they are based in the Great Lakes region, so you're going to see that kind of bent to a lot of their menus, but they're still very relevant and timely for what we're doing here today. So this is an example of all the different menus of strategies that they've created. I'll click on the forested watersheds one. In many cases, they have an interactive version of the menu, so you can just go and look at the menu, and it gives you all these different strategies. And within each strategy, for example, maintaining or restoring forests and vegetative cover, there's a specific action in there about preventing invasive species establishment, and it gives you a little summary of that and what kinds of climate stressors this particular action responds to, and it gives you more specific examples of what people are doing on the ground and references for that. So it's just a really great tool if you want sort of a broader perspective and ideas of the kinds of adaptation and resilience actions that might be out there. The other one that I want to mention is just, again, the Forest Service Adaptation Partners, which is here in the Pacific Northwest. They also have compiled a whole host of adaptation strategies and actions. They call it their adaptation library. So you can go to their library And then it lets you pick the region that you're located in. It lets you pick resource areas, the climate change effects that you're worried about. You can pick keywords. And what it does is it gives you a whole list of different climate change impacts that the strategy responds to, and it gives you different examples of adaptation strategies and actions in there. So it provides that link for you. And these adaptation strategies and actions that are listed within this one were all generated by on-the-ground natural resource managers in the Pacific Northwest. So this is people that are working on this day-to-day that came up with these different examples. So for carbon sequestration and storage, I think Eric mentioned this earlier, we're not asking you to do any quantification here with this. What we're asking is just to simply identify whether or not your project, in this case, might have carbon sequestration or storage benefits. And a great tool to help you do that is this Nature-Based Solutions, or NBS, Benefits Explorer tool that's out there. And it just gives you a really quick snapshot of whether or not what you have planned might have a carbon sequestration benefit. It's a pretty simple tool to use. Over here, asks you to identify your purpose. So you can either start by selecting a specific activity or a specific benefit, like carbon sequestration would be a benefit, for example. In this case, we'll select an activity. We'll stick with the grassland restoration example. I'm working in grassland, so I select that as my habitat type. I'm doing restoration as my intervention. That's what I'm doing. And then you click Update Explorer. And over here on the left, it gives you a whole list of activities that you could be doing in that habitat type. So again, I'm going to select removing invasive species. So I select that, and then what you start to see as you look across the screen are the processes and benefits as a result of implementing that action. So you can see right now that carbon sequestration has been highlighted as a benefit of removing invasive species in grassland ecosystems. So this is, like I said, a very simple tool, and you can pick different activities, planting and maintaining native vegetation. And again, it highlights the different benefits that are expected as a result of you implementing that activity. So not asking for quantification, but just an identification of whether what you have planned is going to have that carbon sequestration or storage benefit. So going back to the question where we asked to describe the direct correlation the engagement effort will have with future restoration or acquisition activities. As applicable, describe how the resulting project or outcome considers changing climate conditions and will protect or restore fish or wildlife habitat, and provide adaptation, resilience, or long-term carbon sequestration or storage benefits. So an example response, looking back and using, again, the grassland example, is that this stakeholder engagement project will improve shrubland and grassland conditions by engaging private landowners in habitat restoration activities and encouraging better stewardship practices. Community members will participate in habitat restoration activities, including removal of non-native annual grasses and planting and seeding with native species. Climate change is projected to lead to decreased spring precipitation and increased summer drought stress. So removing non-native grasses is going to help to reduce competition for limited soil moisture, and planting with native species that are suitable under drier conditions will increase community resilience with climate change. In addition, these actions help to maintain and promote carbon sequestration. So in our application, where we have these questions, there's the little I button that we have for guidance. And within each of those I buttons, we have example responses like this. So if for whatever reason you lose this presentation or forget where the links are, know that when you're filling out your application, there's also example responses like this that are available for you to take a look at. Okay, so I'm just cruising. We are so gonna get done really on time. So what I want to do is just take, let's take a short break. Let's, how about we come back at 1:50, and then we're going to move on to the next section in this. So when you come back, if you have any questions, we'll take questions right before we go on to the next section, and enjoy taking a quick break and come back at 1:50. Well, welcome back. So before we move into our next section, which is that we're going to do breakout groups, what we'd like you to do, we're going to put up a little selection thing here in a moment. But we're going to spend about 15 minutes in breakout groups. We want you to select a breakout group based on what region you're located in. So if you're not familiar with your OWEB region, there's a map here on the right. But at this point, I think I wanted to see if there's any general questions that folks have before we go into breakout group activities. Yeah, Neil.
Since the climate criteria seem to be incorporated into other questions, would it be accurate to say that it doesn't really change the scoring weighting very much?
Well, so for our existing evaluation criteria, we have no weighting. So no criteria are weighted, and these are not weighted either. So these aren't going to be weighted any differently than any of our other existing criteria. So does that answer, is that what you're looking for? I saw the thumbs up. Okay. Yeah, Race.
Can you hear me okay?
Uh-huh.
Cool. There were a couple of resources that you brought up, like the NIACS and the Benefits Explorer. Could you just put those links in the chat when you get a chance, or if someone could? I couldn't write down the names in time.
Yep.
Thank you very
much. No problem. They're also, all of the resources that I've recommended or walked through here today are also on our resources page in that quick guide. Okay, so they'll be available in the slides. So we'll try to make sure they're available to you in multiple ways. But yeah, we can definitely put them in the chat for you too.
That's great. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so Nicole, are you ready to put up there? Okay, so hopefully I don't see it because I'm a co-host, but hopefully you all see it. That you get to select a breakout room, and then we have OWEB regional facilitators. They're going to take you through a couple of questions. I don't know if that was true for other breakout groups. Okay, so good to know that it occurred in many others. So we'll make sure to give you a little bit more time in the next breakout group activity. You can continue the discussions that you've already been having, and just to talk a little bit more through some of the points that you're raising. I think one of the things that was brought up in the second group that I listened in on was a question about how the criteria, these are like, it seems very straightforward to respond to these, but not sure that you're giving information that's maybe any different than you've already provided in projects in the past, or that it's like, what exactly is it? What are we getting out of it more in terms of like understanding these responses to climate, and we're not really doing anything that differently. And I think that's a pretty common response when people are thinking about adaptation, and that's partly why I show the pie chart, is just because so much of adaptation is doing what we're already doing. It's just reframing it in the context of climate and thinking about how it addresses climate change. In many cases, I mean, if you feel like, oh, I'm already doing this, and it's like, if you are welcome to stretch yourself. I fully encourage you to stretch yourself and push and think a little bit more about it. What can you be doing? How can you be modifying what you're doing a little bit more, a little bit better to, to get more of those climate benefits? There are some great adaptation and resilience trainings that are out there where they really sort of push you to think about different ways in doing that. One of the resources, the NIACS adaptation menus, they have awesome trainings that you can attend where you can sort of think more about pushing yourself and other ways to be doing more with climate. So just know this is like our entry point, and we'll see, where we go from here. But also it's incredibly helpful for us to have folks making these links to understanding what they're doing and how it links to climate, how it's addressing climate impacts, how it is building that adaptation and resilience. It's something that OWEB is going to be asked to report on to our board. And in addition, the Oregon Global Warming Commission, now the Oregon Climate Action Commission, they have a natural and working lands group. And as part of that, as a natural and working land state agencies are required to, going forward, going to be required to report on metrics to show progress towards carbon sequestration and storage. So know that the information that you're providing in these applications, it helps us too to articulate some of that progress at the state enterprise level, and that's and to the board too, and helping us better articulate some of the impacts and of these projects. So I'm gonna now share my screen again and go into the next part. And it sounds like some of the groups are already kind of jumping ahead and having some conversations and discussions about some of the other criteria that we haven't gotten to yet, which is great. Okay, so moving on to the third criteria that you're going to be asked about is the consideration of greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration and storage. This corresponds to that step 3 in the quick guide. So this is an example from restoration application. This appears in the design section of it, where it asks you to describe the design alternatives that were considered. And as part of your response, describe how consideration of greenhouse gas emissions or long-term carbon sequestration or storage informed or will inform the design alternatives and the selection of the preferred alternative. So taking a cue from what I did with adaptation and resilience, I want to just have a brief note on GHG emissions, and the purpose of this particular question right now is to demonstrate your thought process. So when we think about GHG emissions and considering GHG emissions and carbon sequestration and storage in our projects, we want you to be thinking about, what are the different options that you considered? What are the things that you adopted, based on all these different options that you thought about in terms of maybe limiting GHG emissions, and then what you discarded and why. And just a quick example from OWEB, having in-person regional climate trainings. So what we considered is that if we drive to each region, it will result in GHG emissions. So that's a consideration, right? If we have a virtual only training and we didn't do in-person climate trainings, it would eliminate that concern. We wouldn't have any GHG emissions. But we have heard from a lot of our partners that they would like more OWEB presence and engagement in the region, have that opportunity for face-to-face interactions. So those are our considerations. So what we decided to adopt is that we'll carpool to these different regional engagements and take a fuel-efficient vehicle. That's what we're going to do. What we discarded and why, having virtual only trainings. Because our partners have requested increased presence and engagement, we feel like this is important for building and maintaining those connections. So even though it was consideration, our choice was to instead adopt the idea of carpooling and taking a fuel efficient vehicle. So we're really just asking you to think through some of the different options for limiting GHG emissions in your project. It could be in the design of it, it could be in the implementation of it. So these are just a handful of examples of options for considering greenhouse gas emissions, things like convening virtual meetings, carpooling or minimizing the number of vehicle trips, limiting the use of heavy equipment, locally sourcing project materials, using electric equipment. And again, we're not asking you to do any quantification here. It's just to think about ways that you could be limiting GHG emissions in your project. So say that I highlighted these 3 examples. I thought, okay, in my project, I could carpool. I can think about options to carpool or minimize the number of vehicle trips. I'll think about limiting the use of heavy equipment, and then I'm going to locally source project materials. So those are the 3 options that I've selected for my particular project. And then we want you to think through and articulate what the trade-offs or constraints are with those different options. So when it comes to carpooling or minimizing trips, the trade-offs pretty limited. It's something we're already doing in our projects because it helps us to save on fuel costs. So this isn't a big stretch for us. It's an added benefit. Limiting the use of heavy equipment. One of the things that we're concerned about if we are going to be limiting the use of heavy equipment is that it's going to take a greater amount of time for us to realize the benefits in our watershed. So our plan was to install large woody debris and re-meander the creek using heavy equipment. And that gives us these immediate habitat benefits. We're creating new habitat, we're creating pools, we're creating that structure. And if our other option was maybe to just do like a riparian planting project. And if we did that, it would take many, many years, decades for us to see some of those benefits materialize, to see some of those trees grow and then fall into our stream. So that's a pretty big trade-off or constraint for us when we're thinking about limiting that use. And then locally sourcing project materials. Maybe our constraint is just having the materials available at the right time, and then some of the new requirements around the BOB Act. So again, trying to articulate, what is it that you considered, what you adopted, what you discarded, and why. So in this case, we adopted that we're going to continue to minimize the number of vehicle trips. We discarded the idea of limiting the use of heavy equipment. So when we looked at our design alternatives and things, we just thought only riparian planting is just going to take too long for us to achieve that result. And so we're just really nervous that that's going to put our fish species at risk due to climate impacts, both in terms of increased flood risk or increased water temperature. And then in terms of locally sourcing project materials, as much as possible, we're going to source large wood from our partners that's about less than a mile away. So that is something we'll try to do as a way to limit GHG emissions in our project. So the other piece of this component or puzzle is this question around promoting carbon sequestration and storage, or what opportunities might there be to modify your project to promote these things. And so I just want to reflect back on some of the resources that are available to you to do this. Again, that Benefits Explorer, I'll go to this again, but I think at the beginning I mentioned that there's two entry points into this tool. The first is you can pick an activity and then look at the benefits conferred from that activity, or you can select a benefit. So if I want to select a benefit, and that's something like carbon sequestration, and I go back to my grasslands and restoration, and then it gives me all these different benefits. So if I pick carbon sequestration, then what it does is it gives me potential project activities that I could consider adding that would confer that carbon sequestration and storage benefit. So that's another way that you can use this Benefits Explorer tool to help you think about promoting or enhancing carbon sequestration or storage in your projects. Again, you don't have to use it, but it is there as a resource. And some of the other ones that are on here, just the Graves paper is a common one used for Oregon, and it talks about different natural climate solutions. And this is a mapping tool and carbon analysis tool. If you want to do some quantification and look at that, you're welcome to. But again, quantification is not a required part of responding to this question. We're asking you to take a look at what opportunities there might be for limiting GHG emissions in your project, considering carbon sequestration and storage, and just sort of demonstrating your thought process and ways that you can potentially think about mitigation, think about those two factors. So here's our application question again. As part of your response, describe how consideration of GHG emissions or long-term carbon sequestration or storage has informed or will inform the design alternatives and selection of the preferred alternative. And so this response basically just articulates what I already went through, which is just that idea around the timing, how long it will take, and why that is going to be important to continue to do that in the project, and some of the benefits that are maybe realized from using that heavy equipment, and why it's important to continue to do that. Okay, so the last criteria that you're going to be asked about is engagement with and input from local communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate change. So this is an application question example in the public awareness section. I think it's in the restoration application. In this case, we had to add this as a new question because we didn't have anything in there that was similar to this. So it reads, describe how engagement with these communities has informed or will inform the project. So Eric shared this earlier as part of the climate rules that were passed. There was a definition for local communities disproportionately impacted by climate change. And these are some of the communities that are called out in the rule language. We pulled this definition. It's from existing state policy for, I think it was drawn from environmental justice communities. That's where this particular list of communities comes from. And I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about a couple of examples as to why these are considered communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate change. So we'll start with rural communities. These communities are highly dependent upon natural resources for their livelihoods and their social structures. Climate impacts are already affecting these communities to a high degree, which is likely to worsen over the coming century. And it will likely shift the locations where some of the rural economic activities like ag and forestry can thrive. And so these communities face a number of different obstacles to responding to risk. So things like physical isolation, limited economic diversity, higher rates of poverty, and an aging population. That combined with the dependence on natural resources for economic livelihoods is what makes these communities considered to be disproportionately impacted by climate change. And this is from, for example, from the National Climate Assessment and information on these communities in that assessment. Communities of color, as another example, are considered to be disproportionately impacted by climate change. They're particularly vulnerable to the greatest impacts of climate change. And that's primarily due to systemic and historic factors that really make these communities more vulnerable. They also tend to live in locations that are really prone to climate-related health hazards. They have greater rates of pre-existing health conditions. They live in areas with poorly maintained or limited infrastructure, things like urban areas where you have just straight concrete, no green spaces or access to green spaces or trees. They have limited financial resources or have other barriers, maybe cultural or language. And they have historically had this lack of power and representation, which makes it really hard for them to contribute any kind of ideas around adaptation and resilience for their communities. So, and this example is from the US EPA. They have a social vulnerability climate change report that came out. So there's a lot of information out there as to why these communities that are listed here are considered to be disproportionately impacted by climate change. So what we're asking you to do is to think about ways in which you can solicit input from these communities. Common methods, I'm guessing most of you are doing some of these already in some way, shape, or form, but maybe just not with these communities. It could be hosting or attending a community event, convening a focus group, organizing online meetings or surveys, or just having one-on-one conversations with representatives from these communities. And then what we're asking is for you to think about where and how their input can inform your project, or where has it already informed your project. So perhaps you engage with these communities to help think about where you might prioritize locations to implement your activities. Maybe they help to provide input into what activities you're going to be implementing, or when they need to be implemented, or how. It could be exploring design alternatives and selecting the preferred alternative. So we recognize that a number of you are submitting, restoration applications already, and you haven't necessarily engaged with these communities. We just encourage you to really think about the ways that you might already be engaging with them. You'll have some time in your breakout group to talk a little bit about this and ways that you might already be doing it, but you just haven't thought about it in this context. And the idea is to get you thinking about ways that you can engage with these communities going forward and use their input in your project. And I will stop and respond to Scott's question.
Oh, thanks. I was just wondering, in this process of engaging with these communities is, it's pretty involved. I mean, it's certainly worthwhile, but would the OWEB grant process allow us that to be a line item in a grant application? I mean, could engaging with these communities be part of an actual project?
So I'll start, and then I might let Eric Williams jump in if he'd like to. But I will say that one of the, I think, best ways to do it is through the stakeholder engagement grant applications. This is a prime way that we offer funding to do these kinds of engagement activities. In terms of a line item in like a restoration application or something else, I will defer to my regional program representatives or Eric Williams to maybe answer that question.
Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, I agree that stakeholder engagement offering is a great way to do that, particularly if you're kind of at the beginning of that engagement. But if you've done some engagement, but you need to do more, sure, a line item in a restoration application is fine. I think, you know, the challenge there for you is to kind of figure out proportionally, you know, what's needed. If you really need to do an awful lot of engagement and that becomes a larger part of a project budget, probably best to do a stakeholder engagement application rather than a restoration application.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for the question, Scott. Oh, Kobe.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think of a lot of grantees think about their day-to-day work. They probably already do a lot of stakeholder engagement. So, for example, websites are a form of stakeholder engagement. All of the different meetings that you may attend.
That's all that we could do.
I'm sorry. Okay, anyway, your website, a newsletter, perhaps the partner meetings that all of you go to with your partners and other stakeholders. So, you know, I think the day-to-day work that many grantees do has a lot of stakeholder engagement already that can be either modified for the project in question or that's being developed, or actually it's already being done. That's it, Jesse.
Thanks, Kobe. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. And this is probably just reiterating points that Kobe and Williams just said, but it's really proportional to the project that you are looking to implement, the type of engagement that should occur. I mean, if you're looking to work in an urban area at, say, a community park, you're probably going to want to do a lot more engagement with these communities. If you're out in a more remote area and there's one or two neighbors and you're doing a pretty standard riparian project, you might be wanting to do that one-on-one approach that Jesse talked about earlier. So you're engaging the rural community there, which is one of the disproportionately impacted communities that are established in our rules. But it's in that rural setting, and you're doing that one-on-one conversation versus, a broader engagement strategy with more members of communities if it's in an urban area.
And Eric, I kind of jumped ahead to your point here, so maybe I'll let you make it since it dovetails to what you just said, and then I can go back.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Jesse. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, when the rules were adopted, we say that grant applications shall also be evaluated whenever possible. And there's certain projects that, and we're thinking particularly along the lines of some restoration or technical assistance projects that may not have a direct engagement link with communities disproportionately impacted by climate change at all. And this example here is a fish passage project in that remote location on public land where there's really no adjacent neighbors. There's not going to be a lot of engagement that needs to occur for this project to happen. Yes, you can include it in newsletters, you can include it on your website, and that's probably enough, to meet this criteria.
Thank you. Okay. So a couple of resources that we recommend or you can take a look at if it's helpful. The first is the US EPA's Environmental Justice Screening and Mapping Tool. You're welcome to use this, so you don't have to. We have the list of disproportionately impacted communities as defined in our rules. But if you'd like to take a look at a mapping tool where you can sort of see where some of these communities fall within your region, within your watershed or project, you can use this tool. You can look, for example, at socioeconomic indicators. So to look at communities that might be experiencing lower incomes. They have a number of different ways that you can basically look at where those environmental justice communities are located across the United States. A similar tool is currently in development for the state of Oregon, but it won't be created or ready for 2 years, I don't think, until end of 2025. The other two resources that are on here, the State of Oregon Climate Equity Blueprint and the Hubbard presentation, are more about how you think about engagement with these communities, how you think about inviting inclusive, meaningful, and equitable engagement, different ways to do that, and just things to be thinking about as you're engaging with these communities and how you invite their input and use their input in a meaningful way. So again, here's our question about describing engagement with these communities and how it has informed or will inform the project. So this is, again, a simple example just about the communities in the region include rural communities and communities of color. We met with representatives from these communities to get their perspectives on what the priority watershed problems are and the proposed project activities. And we use their input to inform the final suite of project activities, including those activities that will most immediately help those priority problems that they identified. Yeah, Neil.
My question is about how to articulate a process like that occurred quite some time before this grant application. You know, we did a 10-year watershed restoration strategy that included an equity lens, and it was actually partially funded by OWEB, and incorporated that input and that demographic and justice data into the identification of our watershed priorities. Now that happened in 2022. Does it still meet the criteria to basically articulate that in these grant applications that said, hey, to get to this project, this was already considered? Or is that kind of too far in the distant past, or how would that be viewed?
It's not too far in the distant past. 2022 is perfectly acceptable. I think in the past, when we've talked about activities that have occurred too far in the past, I think it gets to the 18 months plus 2 year time frame. We haven't defined a time frame for this as too far in the past. I don't know, Eric Hartstein, if anything applies in that term, like in terms of our rules applies here, but I think that's fine to talk about what occurred in 2022, and then that went into informing your priorities and how you ended up with what you're proposing here.
Thank you.
Yeah, Neil, it sounds like you did exactly what the criterion would expect of applicants in this regard. And yeah, 2022, very recent. You should be fine.
And so we have a little bit more time in our breakout groups. I think we'll do at least 15 to 20 more minutes. I don't know if Nicole's already established it, but we'll go back into our breakout groups. We can have some more Q&A with your facilitators and just have those discussions about any of the things that I've just covered, as well as the stuff that maybe you didn't get to continue from earlier, and then we'll reconvene together. So look back. Okay, I'm gonna just, as people are coming back, I wanna make sure, I didn't wanna post some of these, but people are saying they didn't have a chance to write down some of the resource links, so I wanna make sure I'm putting them very quickly in the chat. I'll just put a couple of them there. But as I said, they'll also be available, they are available on our website, and we can send them out as well if it's helpful. Okay, one second, let me get my screen back up. Okay. So just as a reminder, this has come up a couple of times, and I think it came up in one of the breakout groups. that I sat in on earlier. Remember that these new climate criteria are just one of many, so they are not weighted in any way, and they are just another criteria among many that are, for example, our restoration projects are evaluated against. So if you would like to have more help, you still have questions, you're welcome to reach out to me. You can contact me. I have a number of places on my calendar that I've set aside as like open office hours where you can just give me a call and we can talk through your questions. If you want to walk through your draft responses to some of the climate criteria and get feedback on those, you know, are you hitting the mark? Is that what we're looking for? I'm happy to provide that feedback. Feel free to contact me. My email is there as well. And as I said, you know, going forward, we will be thinking about how we can track progress towards some of these different adaptation, resilience, and carbon sequestration and storage metrics and things that have been set out. But for now, we're starting with this sort of, we are starting with this qualitative approach. And whoa, sorry, my mouse is going crazy. Just want to say thank you for your time. We really appreciate you taking 2 hours out of your Wednesday afternoon to be with us. Hopefully the resources and what we've gone through here today give you a really good start to responding to the climate criteria, and hopefully it doesn't feel daunting. So, oh, I see that we have a question or comment from Bruce.
Thank you, Jesse. I just wanted to say what a great meeting this is, and thank the staff and all of the participants. There was a quote of the day from Pope Francis, who is addressing rather tersely the UN on climate on the Feast of St. Francis. And he said, "We must move beyond the mentality of appearing to be concerned, but not having the courage needed to produce substantial changes." Being surrounded or watching all you people with that level of courage is heartening for an old guy. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Again, thank you, everybody. We really appreciate you taking the time. And if you have any questions, please reach out. Happy to help in any way that I can.